What does it mean to be doomed by the narrative? Being doomed by the narrative is often used to describe characters whose fate isn't determined by things like their actions or choices. Instead, they're destined for disaster simply because they were written that way. And for me, no character encapsulates this better than old Delico from the True of Vamp series. Because no matter what, old Delico is going to die. Hi, I'm Stray Dogs, but you can call me Ollie. Today I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite characters of honestly all time. But a quick note before I do that, if you know anything about the True Vamp series, you know that it's a pretty extensive set of plays, musicals, short stories, manga, and even an anime. However, in order to keep things streamlined, I will mainly be focusing on the manga, since I consider it to be the most fully fleshed out version of the original story. However, I will also be touching on the stage plays Gran Guilino and Cocoon upon one of the star. Another small note, I know there's a guy in this called Trump. I'm going to be calling him Trump. I'm not talking about the evil president. Okay? Okay. Now with all of that out of the way, let's get into it. In order to properly talk about Old Delico, it's very important that we talk about his parents first. Old Delico's parents are Sue and Ul Olsen. They grew up together in an origin belief cult that was destroyed by Dolly Delico's father years ago. Together, the two of them hatched a plan to get revenge on the Delico family. Sue became a spy by living in the Delico mansion, while Ul Olsen went off to infiltrate the family in another way. Somewhere along the line, Sue fell pregnant with Ul Olsen's child. However, there was an issue. Sue was a human, while Ul Olsen was a vampire. In the True of Vamp series, human and vampire genetics tend not to mix well. When a Dhampir, the mix of a human and a vampire, is born, they more often than not suffer from birth defects and congenital diseases. Many of them never make it past the cocoon period, which is essentially a more aggressive version of puberty, often plagued by hallucinations and heightened emotions. This leads to Dhampirs infamously having short lifespans. On top of all of this, they are considered to be at the bottom of the hierarchy within the class society of True of Vamp. To be born a Dhampir is often considered to be a curse. For this reason, Sue didn't give her baby a name at first. She confessed to being too scared to, but 6 months after she'd given birth, and in her final moments, she finally gives her son a name, Ul. Ul, which meant hope, according to the town she grew up in. Ul, which was also the name of his father, who, at this point in the story, was unfortunately too far gone. Ul Olsen's mind and body had been taken over by a man named Damien Stone, whose only goal in life was to sow chaos and despair in the name of the vampire god Trump, and he did just that. After Sue's death during the finale of Gran Guilino, Damien Stone, holding baby Ul in his arms, does something horrific. He bites Ul, claiming him under his initiative. Initiative is what happens when a vampire bites another vampire. It gives the biter complete control over who they bit, and this is what Damien Stone's initiative was to his own son. Under my initiative, I command you. Life is a curse that ends in certain death. So, you will fear the shadow of death for life. Until the day your life ends, you will continuously be in despair. At the very end of Gran Guilino, Dolly Delico, who at this point adopted Ul after defeating Damien Stone, manages to give Ul a counter-initiative. Don't give in. Dolly Delico commands his son to fight back against the despair that will attempt to consume his every waking moment. However, the damage was already done. There is no way to reverse an initiative like the one Damien Stone had placed upon Ul. This was Ul's curse. To live a life where his will was at constant war with the dread and fear that consumed his every thought. The next time we see Ul is when he is 14 and in Clan, which is an educational institution that houses teenage vampires going through their cocoon period. In the cocoon, upon one of the star stage play, Ul starts off by introducing himself. He says that he is the second son of the Delico family and discovered he was a Dhampir at the age of 7. As far as he is aware, Dolly Delico is his biological father, and he, Ul, is the result of an affair with a human woman. Ol describes himself as being weak and having a congenital disease which has caused him to spend most of his childhood inside. Now a teenager and in clan, he is instructed to keep his identity as a Dampier a secret. It would disgrace the Delico name if that fact were to ever get out. Ol expresses just how much keeping the secret has negatively affected him. His mere existence brings shame to his family, at least in the eyes of vampiric society. But despite this, his family loves him. Dolly Delico raises and cares for Ol like he's his own. There isn't even a second where Dolly doesn't consider that boy his son. Raphael Delico, Ol's older brother and Dolly's biological son, has sworn to protect Ol no matter what. There's even a short story titled Squishy Magic that talks about just how happy Ol makes his father and brother. And honestly, that's what makes Ol's story all the more heartbreaking. By most measures, he's had a really good life. He comes from an amazing family who adores him, and he's generally seen as a pretty bright and lively kid. But despite all this, that curse of despair looms over him, haunting his every waking moment. And to simply make matters worse, he has no one in his life who could even begin to understand what he's going through. He laments that he will die soon, and the secret of his true identity will die along with him. Ol is scared, and rightfully so. He understandably doesn't want to die, especially so young, and he says that his life is filled with never-ending fear and hopelessness. However, all that changes when somebody new joins the clan. Sophie Anderson. Sophie Anderson is an incredibly important character to Ol's story. There are actually quite a few characters who are pretty relevant to Ol, so I'm just going to quickly introduce them now. I don't want to dive into them too much, however, since they all honestly deserve their own videos. I've already sort of introduced Dolly and Raphael Delico. Dolly is a nobleman who raised both of his children mainly on his own, as his wife Frida passed away that same night Sue Olsen did. Frida Delico is Raphael's mother, by the way. Raphael is Ol's older brother and attends the same clan that Ol does. He's incredibly protective over Ol and has been so since he was a child. Two other notable characters are Angelico Fra and Bonry. Angelico is one of the primary antagonists to Ol's story. He and Raphael were childhood friends, but had a massive falling out a few years ago. This led to him being pretty obsessive over the Delico brothers, mostly harassing Ol in order to further antagonize Raphael. Bonry is a human and a vampire hunter. He was sent to the same clan as everyone else in order to monitor the vampire god Trump, who I've mentioned a couple times by now. I'll just get this out of the way because it'll become more complicated later if I don't. He's this guy, a teacher at the clan named Klaus. No one except the other staff at the school plus Bonry know this, however. And honestly, Bonry isn't super important to Ol, but he is important to Sophie Anderson. And we cannot talk about Old Delico without talking about Sophie Anderson. Because Sophie Anderson is a Dampier just like Ol. Ol's first real impression of Sophie Anderson comes when he watches Sophie beat another student who was previously harassing him for being a Dampier in a swordsmanship match. The other student is a sore loser and starts to tease Sophie about supposedly trying too hard in order to be accepted into vampire society. But Sophie bites back with a pretty important statement. I just didn't want to lose to some purebred who looked down on me because I'm a Dampier. Sophie isn't ashamed of his identity, and nor is he bitter about his fate. He works hard and doesn't want to regret anything he has done. He just wants to live a fulfilling life as a Dampier, no matter how long or short that life may be. Because of this, Sophie Anderson becomes a beacon of hope for Old Delico. If this guy could live without regrets, perhaps he could too. Ol begins his very persistent journey to becoming Sophie's friend. At first, it's quite the struggle since Sophie is a pretty standoffish person, but Ol is very stubborn and basically refuses to leave the guy alone. Despite Ol's constant push for friendship, everyone around him seems vehemently opposed to the idea. While there's a couple of Ol's friends who voice their opinions, even at one point Bonry, of all people, has something to say, Raphael is the one who mainly opposes their friendship. Our first introduction to him in the manga is quite literally him warning Sophie against getting close with his brother. Despite this, Ol and Sophie begin to grow closer, specifically after Ol saves Sophie from jumping off the roof of the school. This was a result of some pretty bad cocoon hallucinations that Sophie was experiencing, where he thought he was on fire and jumping into a river to put out the flames. Ol's hallucinations are something I want to quickly mention. I'll get into more detail later, but for now, just know that his hallucinations tend to be pretty rough. The first one we actually get to see in the manga is one where a flaming skeleton reaches out and embraces him. From how he reacts, it's safe to say that this is a pretty common hallucination for him. It's also common for Ol to see his own body decaying. Both of these are directly related to the curse that Damien Stone placed upon him as a baby, but once again, I'll touch on that a little bit more later. The summer months roll around, and it's evident that Ol's physical and mental conditions are worsening. He hasn't been to class in a few weeks, and he's also gotten a lot less patient with those around him. A few of his old friends once again question why he's hanging around Sophie, and instead of just humoring them like he'd done in the past, Ol just straight up tells them to shut up and walks away. Sophie ends up finding Ol in the restricted section of the school library, and this is where Ol confesses something rather important. Ol wants to live forever. He expresses that this has been a dream of his ever since he was a kid, to live eternally as he is now. It's my personal belief that this desire is a direct result of both Damien Stone and Dolly Delico's initiatives clashing. Stone's initiative to live a life full of despair and fear of death, and Dolly's counter-initiative to never give into that despair. They clash in such a way that leads Ol to crave the extreme. After all, one way to stop being afraid of death is to never die. During this section of them in the library, we also encounter Angelico, who starts a pretty nasty fight that involves both Delico brothers, and also results in Dolly being called in for what equates to a parent-teacher meeting, which is, honestly, pretty funny. In this meeting, Ol's friendship is once again scrutinized, this time by his own father. Dolly goes as far as to refer to Dampiers as scum, and obviously Ol takes offense to this, asking his father, if Sophie is just scum, then what am I? Dolly simply states that Ol's a Delico child, which upsets the kid, and he runs off. This is also when things really start to take a turn for Ol. We find him later on, and he's once again hallucinating. This time, he sees the corpse of his biological father reaching out to him from the ground below. It's revealed that he often hears Damien's voice echoing the curse placed upon him. Ol says this: "Every time I hear that voice, it feels like I'm being thrown into a dark, pitch-black ocean. Cold, painful, scared. I can't breathe right. The shadows are growing darker, and no one understands. But of course, there is someone who understands. Sophie." I honestly cannot even properly express how important Sophie is to Ol. He holds Sophie in such high regard, earlier even talking about how amazing Sophie was, how much more noble and proud he was compared to anyone else. Later on, Sophie's even referred to as Ol's star by Dolly Delico, who also once referred to his wife as his star, which, okay. Anyways, at one point, another small fight ends up breaking out, starting with Ol punching Bonry after he made a comment about his and Sophie's friendship, and ending with Ol and Sophie having to break apart Raphael and Bonry. Fights obviously happen a lot at this school. Most, if not all, of the students are constantly on the verge of psychotic break thanks to their cocoon beard systems. And to be quite frank, I don't know why they thought clans were a good idea. Anyways, after this fight, Sophie ends up blaming Ol for everything being so messed up, and months pass, and these two rarely speak anymore. The students are getting ready for ClanFest, which is basically just an event dedicated to presenting the students to Vampire Society. Sort of like a debutante ball, if you know what that is. One day, Ol finds Sophie, who has been avoiding him, sitting alone and drags him back down to the restricted library. You can just see it on Ol's face that he isn't doing well. He talks about immortality more fervently, attempting to convince Sophie that this is really the only way. Sophie expresses his distaste for immortality, despite Ol mentioning how Dampiers rarely reach adulthood. Sophie admits that he sort of already accepted his fate, that yeah, he's scared of dying so young, but it's unfortunately inevitable. Ol promises to always protect Sophie right before attempting to bite him. Luckily, they get interrupted by this guy. At another point in time, another fight breaks up between a massive group of students, Sophie being involved, and to no one's surprise, this is Angelico's fault. He used his initiative on a bunch of students and had them attack Sophie. Old rushes in to save Sophie, and they manage to temporarily escape the fight, but are quickly chased down by Angelico and his group. A lot happens sort of all at once, but most notably, Old begins to have like an attack of sorts. It's never explained exactly what happens, but we can assume it has something to do with his heart failing since we're shown this panel. Sophie keeps begging everything to stop, and strangely enough, everything does stop. Angelico describes it as his body being completely at Sophie's mercy. When Sophie tells him to drop his sword, Angelico does. All of the students who were attacking are now on their knees, bowing before Sophie, who has no clue what is happening. Now, obviously, Sophie wasn't the one to do this. We can see Klaus in this panel right here watching the fight, clearly indicating that he was the one to stop everything. After all, being the god of vampires, he pretty much has control over all vampires. We'll see more of that later. But still, Ol stares at Sophie in disbelief before asking, "Are you Trump?" Sophie says no, but Ol doesn't listen. He hugs Sophie tightly and says, "Oh God, a miracle is standing right in front of me." It's important to note that "oh God" isn't an exclamation here. Ol is calling Sophie his god. He continues to beg for salvation despite Sophie's protests, and then he finally says it. Old Delico says what he's been longing to tell everyone this whole time. "I'm a Dhampir." Now again, up until this point, the only people who knew about this other than Ol himself were Dolly and Raphael Delico. Ol continues on, confessing to Sophie that he is going to die soon, just like him. In the aftermath of all of this, we see Ol's mental state rapidly decline. It's clearly been a few hours since the fight, but he's still on about his vampiric god. He's screaming at people, demanding to know where Trump is. When his father finally arrives to help deal with the situation, Ol continues on, asking why exactly he was brought into this world, and how it's just absolutely unbearable. We see Ol on the floor of his bedroom crying and muttering to himself, still convinced that Sophie will be the one to save him, granting him eternal life. I think one really upsetting aspect to this story is that you're just sort of watching Ol deteriorate. He goes from this bright, fun kid to a husk of his former self. There are even some parts in the manga where you can literally see the life leaving his eyes. And the saddest part is, this was all inevitable. The next time we see Old Delico is at Clanfest, that aforementioned festival that introduces the students to Vampire Society. He's quiet and distant, not speaking to old friends and sitting by himself. Sophie eventually approaches Ol, and although it's not clearly stated, it can be assumed that these two haven't spoken much, as Sophie attempts to talk about Ol's upcoming swordsmanship match, but Ol steers the conversation to immortality once again. Sophie brings the topic back to the swordsmanship tournament happening at Clanfest, encouraging Ol to do his best so that both of them can face off against each other in the finals. Sophie is up against Raphael for his semifinal match and ends up winning. Raphael, now publicly humiliated for losing to a Dhampir and also basically on the verge of a mental break, bites Sophie in front of everyone at Clanfest. And now, I know I've previously said I won't be focusing too much on the other characters, but for the ending of this story, I'm gonna have to. Up until this point, I've admittedly been leaving quite a bit out. I honestly haven't even begun to get into the B-plot of the manga, aside from mentioning Bonnery and Klaus a few times. I've done this because while it's all very important to the story, everything in the manga sort of has to be important because there's only 30 chapters. It's not important to Ol. However, in order to explain the ending to Ol's story, I'm gonna have to explain the end to the entire manga. Raphael, in the middle of attempting to publicly end Sophie's life, bursts into flames in front of all of Vampire Society, including his father and brother. This begins a chain reaction in which everyone starts to ignite into flames. The cause of all of this is Trump, the vampiric god, the original vampire, who we all know to be Klaus. Now, obviously, this was meant to be some grand reveal, but again, to make things easier, I already revealed Klaus's true identity earlier. I promise it makes so much more sense once you read the actual manga, since the entire B-plot of the manga is actually about Klaus himself. I just haven't mentioned it up until now because it's not important to Ol. And the reason this isn't important to Ol is very simple. Klaus doesn't care about Ol. He only cares about Sophie. This is due to Sophie being related to a student from 100 years ago that Klaus was close to. Klaus offers immortality to Sophie, but Sophie rejects his offer. Ol, of course, is eager to volunteer in Sophie's place. He begs Klaus to make him immortal, despite Klaus never saying anything in return. And just as Ol once again reiterates how scared he is of dying, he's stabbed by Angelico. Just like everyone else, Angelico has gone off the deep end. In his grief over witnessing Raphael's sudden death, he demands that Klaus turns all vampires into immortals. Klaus responds by burning Angelico and the rest of the students who have yet to evacuate. The only ones that remain are Sophie, Ol, and Bonri. Ol, despite his wound, continues his pleas to Klaus, then turns to Sophie. He grabs the knife that he was stabbed with and begins to blame Sophie, saying that if Sophie wasn't here, then Klaus would have chosen him. He attempts to attack Sophie in a fit of grief and rage, Bonri temporarily holding him back before his throat is slashed by Ol. Ol climbs atop Sophie, raises his knife for the kill, but he can't do it. He cannot bring himself to kill the one person who truly understands him, the one person who gave him hope in a world full of despair and fear. In one last attempt, Ol begs Klaus to choose him, but it is dismissed. Instead, Klaus turns his attention to Sophie, and without his consent, and knowing that this was the last thing Sophie ever wanted, bites him and turns Sophie immortal. With that, Klaus disappears, and the only two remaining within the rubble of the school are the now immortal Sophie and Ol. Within his dying moments, Ol apologizes for his actions. Sophie tries to save him by biting Ol, but to no avail. Within his final words, Ol takes a moment to talk about how kind Sophie is and admits to being jealous of him. He says that he always hated being born a Dampier, and he was bitter about that being his fate. He ends up trailing off before being able to finish what he wanted to say, but we can tell by both the manga and the stage play that his final words were, if he could be reborn, he wanted to be like Sophie. And with that, old Delico is dead. His body is later found without any burns, despite the area around him being scorched. It's stated that it's almost as if someone had been shielding his body, waiting for the flames to eventually die down. Dolly Delico is brought to the body of his son and cradles his boy in his arms one last time. He tells those around him to not grieve, that no one is allowed to mourn Old's death. He sees that his son's body was untouched by flames and that there's a bite mark on his neck, showing that even until the very end, at least someone was trying to save old Delico. The end to Ol's story is a sad one, but like I said before, it was unfortunately inevitable. Old Delico was doomed from the moment he was born. Dampiers already don't live long, but on top of that, he was cursed with two clashing initiatives, one telling him to give in to despair, while the other was telling him to fight against it. But it goes even beyond that, because one thing will always remain a constant in every True of Vamp story, that old Delico is going to die. In Gran Galena, you watch as Dolly Delico cradles Ol in his arms, telling him to not give in to the despair he was cursed with, knowing that in the end, Ol dies. In Delico's nursery, you once again see Ol as a baby, but you also get to see him as an adult in Dolly's dream in the final episode. It serves as a cruel reminder that Ol never got to reach adulthood. In Cocoon, Dark of the Moon, Raphael talks about how much he wants to protect his younger brother, but you have to watch that knowing Raphael was never able to do so. Because old Delico is going to die, and there's nothing that anyone can do about it. I hope you all enjoyed this video. I've never really made YouTube videos like this before, let alone any at all. And I've really also shared my analysis on characters, but I absolutely adore the True of Vamp series and want to talk about it more. Anyways, like and subscribe if you feel up to it. I hope you have a good day. Bye!